The Indian Ocean, July 2nd, 1944. On the steel foredeck of the Japanese submarine I-8, 100 men huddled together under a moonless sky. They are the survivors of the American Liberty ship, the Jean Nicolet. Just hours ago, they were sailors, merchants, and soldiers, united by the common purpose of a global war. Now they are prisoners, stripped of their uniforms, their dignity, and their hope. The dark, oily water churns around the sleek hull of the submarine, a monstrous leviathan that has risen from the depths to claim their ship. But it is not the sea they fear. It is the men who command it. One by one, they are forced to their feet. Their hands are bound tightly behind their backs. A gauntlet of Japanese sailors lines the narrow path from the bow to the stern. In their hands, they grip not rifles, but crude instruments of torment, steel pipes, wooden clubs, bayonets used not for piercing, but for bludgeoning. A voice barks an order, and the first man is shoved forward. He stumbles, trying to keep his footing on the slick, wet deck. The blows begin to rain down upon him. A sickening crack of bone, a choked cry swallowed by the vast emptiness of the ocean. He is beaten, broken, and then kicked or perhaps simply collapses over the side and into the black water. Then the next man is called. This is not combat. This is not the grim, impersonal calculus of war. This is a ritual of extermination, a slow, methodical process of erasure. For the men still waiting on the bow, squatting in terrified silence, every scream, every thud of metal on flesh is a preview of their own fate. They are witnesses to their own murder, played out in agonizing slow motion. Suddenly, the deck beneath them lurches. An alarm blares. The submarine is diving. The remaining prisoners, their hands still bound, are unceremoniously washed into the churning sea by the surging waves as the I-8 slips back beneath the surface, leaving them to their fate. Of the 100 souls aboard the Jean Nicolet, only 23 would survive the ordeal, clinging to debris, their minds forever seared with the image of that nightmarish gauntlet. This horrific event was not an anomaly. It was a single brutal chapter in a much larger, darker story. And it is a story that officially, diplomatically reached a boiling point just 1 month earlier. On June 5th, 1944, a day the world would remember for other reasons, the British government delivered a formal protest to the Japanese Foreign Ministry. The message, relayed through the neutral Swiss, was stark and unequivocal. It spoke of brutal treatment by Japanese submariners toward survivors of their conquests, and demanded immediate instructions to prevent the repetition of similar atrocities. June 5, 1944, the eve of D-Day. As the largest amphibious force in human history gathered in the English Channel, preparing to storm the beaches of Normandy and change the course of the war in Europe, the corridors of power in London were consumed with a different kind of horror, one unfolding thousands of miles away in the sun-scorched waters of the Indian Ocean. While the world's attention was fixed on the coming liberation of France, a forgotten war was being waged against the most fundamental laws of the sea, a war against the very concept of mercy. The story of these atrocities, of ships like the Jean Nicolet, the Tjisalak, and the Behar, has largely been submerged by the grand narratives of the Second World War. It is a tale lost between the titanic clashes of battleships in the Pacific and the grinding land campaigns of Europe and Asia. But to ignore it is to misunderstand the true nature of total war. It is to overlook a chapter where the accepted rules of engagement were not merely bent, but systematically shattered. This is not a story of isolated incidents or the actions of a few rogue commanders. This documentary will argue a far more disturbing thesis: that the widespread, systematic massacre of Allied merchant mariners by the Imperial Japanese Navy was the direct and predictable result of a military ideology that deliberately and consciously rejected the Western laws of war. It was a philosophy that redefined surrender as the ultimate dishonor, that viewed compassion as a fatal weakness, and that systematically dehumanized its enemies until they were no longer seen as shipwrecked sailors in need of rescue, but as vermin to be exterminated. We will trace how this ideology, born from a warped interpretation of ancient warrior codes and amplified by the pressures of a desperate war, transformed the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean into a killing field. This is the story of how the unwritten sacred law of the sea, that one does not harm a survivor in the water, was drowned in an ocean of blood. and how the dominoes of this brutal policy fell one by one, culminating in some of the most shocking and least-known war crimes of the entire conflict. We will journey back to the genesis of these laws, to a time when naval warfare, for all its violence, still clung to a code of conduct. We will then descend into the heart of the Japanese war machine, into the minds of the men who gave and carried out these horrific orders. We will piece together the harrowing testimonies of the few who survived, men who witnessed the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. And we will conduct an autopsy of these events, not merely to recount the horror, but to understand the mechanism of cruelty itself. How does a professional naval officer, a man trained in navigation, strategy, and tradition, order his crew to bludgeon and machine gun helpless men clinging to life rafts? What does it take to turn a submarine's deck into an execution platform? The answers are complex and unsettling, revealing a truth about the fragility of civilization itself. This is the story of the lost laws of the sea and the men who paid the price when they vanished. For centuries, the world's oceans were governed by a set of principles that transcended national flags and wartime allegiances. This was the unwritten law of the sea, a code born from the shared vulnerability of all who venture upon the waves. It dictated that a sailor's duty to another sailor in distress was absolute. A shipwrecked mariner, regardless of his uniform, was to be rendered aid, not harm. This was not merely a matter of sentimentality. It was a pragmatic contract of survival. The sea was the common enemy, and the man you rescued today might be the one to rescue you tomorrow. As the technology of warfare evolved, this ancient code was formalized, codified into international law, a desperate attempt by civilization to place limits on its own destructive impulses. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 were landmark achievements, establishing rules for the humane treatment of prisoners of war and civilians. But it was the rise of a new and terrifying weapon, the submarine, that forced the world's naval powers to confront a new ethical dilemma. A submarine's greatest strength was its stealth. To operate effectively, it had to strike from the depths and disappear. This clashed directly with the established cruiser rules of naval warfare. These rules, a legacy of the Age of Sail, required a warship, before sinking an unarmed merchant vessel, to first stop it, search it for contraband, and ensure its crew was safely in lifeboats before dispatching the ship to the bottom. For a fragile, thin-hulled submarine to surface and announce its presence to a potentially armed merchantman was to invite its own destruction. The tension between military necessity and maritime law came to a head during the First World War. Germany's campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, culminating in the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, provoked global outrage, and was a key factor in America's entry into the war. In the aftermath, the global community sought to put the genie back in the bottle. The London Naval Treaty of 1930, signed by all major naval powers, including the Empire of Japan, explicitly stated that submarines must adhere to the same international laws as surface vessels. They could not sink a merchant ship without first having placed passengers, crew, and ship's papers in a place of safety. The treaty was clear, its intent unambiguous. The massacre of civilians and unarmed sailors at sea was a crime. This was the myth, the accepted reality, the legal and moral framework that was supposed to govern the war at sea as the world tumbled towards another global conflict in 1939. By 1944, however, this framework had been shattered. The Indian Ocean, often seen as a secondary theater to the titanic struggles in the Pacific and Europe, had become a vast and lawless hunting ground. It was the vital artery of the Allied war effort in the East. Convoys laden with troops, fuel, and supplies steamed from the ports of South Africa and the Middle East, heading for the battlefronts in Burma and the Pacific. These were the lifelines, and severing them was a strategic priority for the Axis powers. German U-boats, operating from bases in occupied France and later from Penang in Japanese-controlled Malaya, prowled these waters, joined by their allies from the Imperial Japanese Navy. For the men of the Allied merchant navy, the journey was a perilous one. They were civilians in all but name, volunteers who faced the same dangers as enlisted sailors, but with none of the fanfare. Their ships were often old, slow, and lightly armed, easy prey for the sleek, modern submarines that stalked them from below. The threat of a torpedo strike was a constant companion, a sudden, violent end that could come at any moment, day or night. Yet even in this atmosphere of constant fear, there was a shared assumption, a lingering belief in the old codes. If the worst happened, if their ship was mortally wounded, they believed they had a fighting chance. They would take to the lifeboats, and while they might face a grueling ordeal of survival against the elements, they did not expect to be hunted. They did not expect the submarine that had just sunk their home to surface and turn its machine guns on them. This was the antagonist of our story. Not a single man or nation, but the death of a belief, the evaporation of a sacred trust in the face of a new and ruthless doctrine of total war. The seeds of this doctrine had been planted deep within the culture of the Imperial Japanese military long before Pearl Harbor. The modernization of Japan during the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century had been breathtakingly rapid, but it was a process that grafted Western technology onto a deeply traditional, feudal social structure. The military in particular adopted a highly distorted and nationalistic interpretation of the ancient samurai code of Bushido. In this modern incarnation, Bushido was stripped of its emphasis on benevolence and compassion, and instead focused almost exclusively on absolute loyalty to the emperor and the concept of death before dishonor. Surrender was not a tactical option. It was the ultimate disgrace, a stain upon one's family and nation. A soldier's duty was to fight to the last man, and if victory was impossible, to die in a final glorious charge, a gyokusai, or shattering of the jewel. This mindset created a profound and dangerous psychological disconnect. If surrender was the ultimate shame for a Japanese soldier, then an enemy soldier who surrendered was, by definition, contemptible. He had forfeited his honor, his humanity, and his right to be treated with dignity. This contempt for prisoners was not just an attitude, it was policy. It was evident in the brutal treatment of Allied POWs in camps across Asia, in the Bataan Death March, and in the kill-all orders issued to troops on the Chinese mainland. This ideology inevitably seeped into the Imperial Japanese Navy. While naval traditions worldwide often fostered a sense of international fraternity, the Japanese Navy of the 1930s and 40s was increasingly dominated by hardline nationalists who viewed the Anglo-American powers as decadent and racially inferior. They saw the international treaties limiting naval armament and codifying maritime law not as instruments of civilization, but as shackles designed by the West to keep Japan in a subordinate position. As the war in the Pacific turned against them, as their losses mounted, and the American industrial juggernaut began to overwhelm them, desperation intensified this ruthless ideology. The war became existential. Any and all means to cripple the enemy were justified. The merchant ships supplying the Allied war machine were not just targets. They were extensions of an enemy that had to be annihilated. And their crews were not just sailors. They were components of that machine. Killing them was not just an act of cruelty. It was a strategic imperative. It would sow terror, disrupt supply lines, and perhaps force the enemy to divert precious warships to escort duties. In this brutal new calculus, a shipwrecked sailor was no longer a neutral victim of war. He was a future combatant, a skilled worker who, if rescued, would simply man another ship and bring another cargo of death to the shores of the empire. Therefore, he had to be eliminated. The law of the sea was a Western luxury that a nation fighting for its very survival could no longer afford. The stage was set. In the vast, lonely expanse of the Indian Ocean, the myth of chivalrous naval combat was about to collide with the horrifying reality of total war. The domino that would expose this horrifying new reality fell on March 26, 1944. Its fall would send a shockwave of terror through the Allied merchant fleets and lay bare the abyss that had opened between the laws of war and the practice of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ship was the Chisalak, a Dutch freighter steaming alone in the Indian Ocean, its holds filled with a cargo of flour. On board was a crew of 103 men, a mix of Dutch officers, Chinese sailors, and a handful of passengers, including a few British subjects and an American woman. They were far from the main battlefronts, sailing a lonely route, but they were not safe. Beneath the waves, they were being stalked by one of the most infamous submarines of the war, The I-8, commanded by Captain Arizumi Tatsunosuke. Arizumi was not a typical naval officer. He was a hardliner, a fervent nationalist, and a man who had earned a reputation for extreme ruthlessness. To his admirers, he was a dedicated patriot who understood the brutal necessities of total war. To his victims and many of his peers, he was a butcher. His orders, whether explicit from high command or born of his own initiative, reflected the darkest interpretation of Japanese military doctrine. Leave no one alive. The enemy was not to be captured. He was to be erased. 2 torpedoes from the I-8 slammed into the Chisalak, and the ship began to sink rapidly. The crew, disciplined and professional, abandoned ship in an orderly fashion, taking to the lifeboats and rafts. As the freighter slipped beneath the waves, the I-8 surfaced. Initially, there was a glimmer of hope. The Japanese sailors ordered the survivors to come alongside. Perhaps they would be taken prisoner, the standard practice in a war between civilized nations. The survivors were herded onto the submarine's foredeck. There were 98 of them in all. 5 men, including the ship's second officer, managed to hide on a life raft that drifted away in the confusion. A fortunate accident that would make them the sole witnesses to the horror that was about to unfold. Once the 98 men were crowded onto the deck, the atmosphere changed. The pretense of taking prisoners vanished. The Japanese crew, acting with cold, practiced efficiency, began to tie the survivors' hands behind their backs. The prisoners were split into groups. The first group, which included the ship's captain, was taken to the conning tower. The rest were forced to watch from the bow. Then the executions began. One by one, the men were led to the stern. There was no firing squad, no quick, merciful end. This was a spectacle of cruelty. The Japanese sailors, armed with swords, bayonets, and heavy spanners used as clubs, set upon the helpless men. What followed was a medieval scene of butchery played out on the deck of a 20th century war machine. The crew of the I-8 seemed to revel in the slaughter, hacking, stabbing, and bludgeoning the prisoners with savage fury. The sounds carried across the water to the 5 horrified men hiding on the distant raft. The sickening thuds, the sharp crack of blades on bone, the screams of agony that were quickly silenced. The deck of the I-8, washed by the ocean spray, ran red with blood. When the gruesome work was done, the submarine's crew simply washed the gore overboard. The 98 prisoners from the Chisalak were gone. The I-8 submerged and sailed away, leaving a silent, empty ocean. The 5 survivors, adrift and traumatized, would eventually be rescued, their testimony providing the first undeniable proof of the systematic nature of these massacres. The sinking of the Chisalak was not the beginning, but it was a turning point. It was so brutal, so methodical, and so well attested by its few survivors that it shattered any lingering illusions about the enemy's conduct. It revealed that what had been happening in the shadows of the Indian Ocean was not a series of isolated acts by sadistic captains, but something closer to a policy. It was a catalyst, forcing Allied command to confront a truth they may have been reluctant to acknowledge. Looking back, the pattern became chillingly clear. Just a month earlier, on February 29th, the SS Ascot, a British tramp steamer, had been torpedoed in the same waters. As the survivors scrambled onto rafts and clung to wreckage, the Japanese submarine that had sunk them surfaced. Instead of offering aid or taking prisoners, the crew opened up with machine guns, methodically strafing the men in the water. They took their time, ensuring their aim was true. Of the 52 men who abandoned ship, only a handful managed to escape the hail of bullets by feigning death or diving repeatedly beneath the waves. 8 men survived the initial massacre, a testament to sheer luck and primal will. The message was the same. Survival was not permitted. The pattern repeated, again and again, with sickening regularity. On March 18th, the tanker, Nancy Moller, was sunk by the I-165. Survivors in the water were systematically targeted with pistol and machine gun fire. 32 men were murdered after they had already lost their ship. Prior to that, in December 1943, the merchant ship Daisy Moller met a similar fate. After being sunk by the RO-110, the submarine deliberately rammed the lifeboats, spilling the crew into the water. Then, the machine guns opened up. 53 men died, not from the sinking of their ship, but from the deliberate actions of their attackers. Each of these events was a domino. The Daisy Moller demonstrated a willingness to kill survivors. The Ascot confirmed it was not an isolated incident. the Nancy Mauler, reinforced the pattern. But the Chisalak was the event that laid the entire horrifying mechanism bare. The sheer, hands-on brutality of the massacre, using swords and clubs, was a profound psychological escalation. It was not the impersonal killing of a machine gun from a distance. It was intimate, visceral, and required a level of dehumanization that was truly shocking. It proved that this was not merely about eliminating potential future combatants. It was about terror, about indulging a deep-seated contempt for the enemy, and about adhering to an ideology that saw mercy as a corrupting influence. The testimony of the Chisalak survivors spread like wildfire through the merchant navy. Sailors in the ports of Durban, Colombo, and Fremantle spoke in hushed, angry tones. The unwritten law was dead. The ocean was no longer a neutral space governed by ancient codes. It was a battlefield where the fight did not end when your ship went down. For a merchant mariner, the torpedo was no longer the greatest fear. The greatest fear was what came after. It was the sight of the submarine surfacing, the hatch opening, and the crew appearing on deck, not with ropes and supplies, but with rifles and swords. And the Chisalak massacre was the inciting incident that transformed fear into a certainty and forced the Allied powers, who were fighting a global war on dozens of fronts, to finally acknowledge the depraved nature of the enemy they faced in the forgotten war on the waves. The official British protest of June 5th was a direct consequence. A diplomatic shot fired in response to the very real shots that were murdering their sailors. The dominoes were now falling in the open. To truly comprehend the depth of this depravity, we must conduct a forensic autopsy of these events, examining the brutal mechanics of each atrocity and understanding the twisted logic that drove them. The truth revealed by this examination is the direct opposite of the myth of honorable naval warfare. The truth is that for the Imperial Japanese Navy in this theater, the sinking of a ship was merely the prelude. The real work, the disposal of the survivors, came after. This was the twist. The war against the ship was conventional, but the war against its crew was something else entirely. A campaign of extermination. Let us return to the deck of the I-8 on that horrific night of July 2nd, 1944, and the ordeal of the crew of the Jean Nicolet. The I-8, under the command of the same Ariizumi Tatsunosuke who had orchestrated the Chisalak massacre, was not just a submarine, it was a mobile death camp. The gauntlet the prisoners were forced to run was a carefully constructed piece of psychological warfare. It was designed not only to kill, but to terrorize and degrade. By using clubs and iron bars instead of firearms, the Japanese crew turned the act of killing into a laborious, personal, and brutalizing act. It forced a physical intimacy with the violence. This wasn't a distant execution, it was a savage beating. Forcing the remaining prisoners to watch was a crucial element. It stripped them of hope, broke their spirit, and amplified their terror, making them compliant before their own turn came. The final cynical act of submerging the submarine to wash the rest overboard was a gesture of ultimate contempt. It was a statement that their lives were so worthless, they were not even deserving of a deliberate death. They were simply discarded. The ripple effect of this one incident was immense. The 23 survivors, rescued after 30 hours in the water, brought back a story so horrific it was almost unbelievable. Their detailed accounts provided prosecutors at the post-war trials with irrefutable evidence against Ariizumi and his crew. More immediately, it sent another wave of dread through the merchant marine. The name I-8 became legendary, a byword for pure evil. Sailors knew that an encounter with this particular wolf of the sea meant a sentence of death. The case of the tanker, British chivalry, sunk by the I-37 on February 22, 1944, reveals another facet of this policy. After the ship went down, the survivors managed to get away in 2 lifeboats. They were clear of the wreckage, organized, and posed no threat whatsoever. The I-37 surfaced nearby. The submarine circled the lifeboats, its crew watching the men impassively. Then, without warning, its machine guns opened fire. The bullets ripped through the thin wooden hulls of the boats and tore into the bodies of the defenseless men. It was a turkey shoot. 20 men were killed in this cold-blooded attack. The submarine then submerged, leaving the remaining survivors in their shattered, blood-soaked boats. For them, a new ordeal began. a 37-day drift across the Indian Ocean, a voyage through a personal hell of starvation, thirst, and exposure, haunted by the memory of the massacre. This event proved that even the relative safety of a lifeboat meant nothing. The policy was not just to kill those in the water, but to hunt down and destroy those who had successfully escaped their sinking vessel. But perhaps the most chilling domino to fall was the one that proved this brutal philosophy was not confined to the submarine fleet. It reached into the very heart of the Japanese surface navy, to the crews of its powerful cruisers and the officers who commanded them. The story of the British motor vessel, Behar, is the final damning piece of evidence. On March 18, 1944, the Behar was sunk by the heavy cruiser Tone, one of the most formidable ships in the Japanese fleet. Over 100 survivors were picked up and taken aboard the cruiser. They were now official prisoners of war, under the protection of the Geneva Convention, to which Japan was a signatory, even if it had not ratified all of its provisions. They were on the deck of a capital ship of a major navy, not a rogue submarine. They had every reason to expect proper treatment. But the captain of the Tone, Haruo Mayuzumi, received a chilling order from his superior, Vice Admiral Naomasa Sakonju, commander of the 16th Division. The order was simple and direct. Dispose of all prisoners. How this disposal was carried out reveals the deep-seated cultural pathology at work. The 72 remaining survivors, a mix of 27 Europeans and 45 Indian sailors, were brought up on deck. They were not simply shot. They were subjected to a final ritual of humiliation and pain. They were kicked, beaten with rifle butts in the stomach and groin, and then, as they lay writhing in agony, they were forced to kneel. One by one, they were beheaded with swords. It was a gruesome feudal execution, a performance of dominance and contempt. The Behar massacre is the crucial link in the chain. It demonstrates beyond any doubt that the policy of killing survivors was not the invention of a few sadistic submarine commanders like Ariazumi. It was an operational doctrine, sanctioned at the highest levels of fleet command. The actions of the Tone's crew were not a spontaneous outburst of rage. They were the carrying out of a direct order. The ripple effect was profound. If the crew of a decorated heavy cruiser could be ordered to commit such a war crime, then no one was safe. The entire Imperial Japanese Navy was implicated. The why behind these atrocities is rooted in the perversion of Bushido. The code that once preached honor and self-control was twisted into a justification for barbarism. The intense indoctrination of Japanese soldiers and sailors taught them that their enemies were racially and morally inferior. The act of surrender was proof of this inferiority. A man who gives up is not a man. He is less than human, and you cannot murder something that is not human. This process of dehumanization is a necessary precondition for mass atrocity, seen in genocides throughout history. It allows ordinary men to commit extraordinary evil by convincing them that their victims are not like them. The Japanese sailor who beat a helpless prisoner to death on the deck of the I-8 did not see a fellow mariner. He saw a symbol of the decadent West, a piece of the enemy war machine that had to be broken. The officer on the Tone who drew his sword did not see a man. He saw an object of contempt whose life had been forfeited the moment he was captured. This policy was also driven by a desperate and brutal pragmatism. Taking prisoners was a logistical burden. They had to be fed, guarded, and transported, consuming precious resources. Submarines, in particular, had no space for prisoners. Killing them was simply more efficient. Furthermore, the Japanese High Command believed that this reign of terror would have a strategic effect. News of the massacres would spread, as it did, and it would terrify merchant crews, potentially making it harder for the Allies to man their ships and keeping vital supplies from reaching the front. It was a form of psychological warfare, waged not with propaganda leaflets, but with swords and machine guns. The ripples spread from the decks of these ships across the ocean and into the halls of power in London and Washington, forcing a confrontation with a level of inhumanity that defied the established rules of modern war. The domino effect was complete, from a single act of brutality to a systematic policy of extermination, sanctioned from the top down. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent, A shocked world began the monumental task of accounting for the crimes that had been committed. The Nuremberg trials of Nazi leaders set a powerful precedent. Military and political leaders would be held responsible for ordering and carrying out atrocities. In the East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal sought to bring similar justice to the leaders of Imperial Japan. But what of the men who had turned the Indian Ocean into a charnel house? What was the legacy of their brutal campaign? The pursuit of justice was fraught with difficulty. The ocean, by its very nature, hides evidence. The primary witnesses were often the victims themselves, 98 of whom lay at the bottom of the sea after the Chisalak massacre. Only the testimony of the few traumatized survivors could bring these crimes to light. Despite these challenges, Allied investigators painstakingly pieced together the story. The commander of the I-37, which had massacred the survivors of the British chivalry, was tried and executed. Vice Admiral Sakonju, who gave the order to execute the prisoners from the Behar, was convicted of war crimes and hanged. His subordinate, Captain Mayuzumi of the cruiser Tone, was also sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted. The fate of the most notorious perpetrator, Captain Arizumi Tatsunosuke of the I-8, remains shrouded in a fog of war. As American forces closed in on Japan in August 1945, Ariazumi, facing the humiliation of surrender he so despised in others, reportedly committed suicide in his cabin. He never faced a tribunal for the massacres of the Chisalak and Jean Nicolet. He chose to escape justice, leaving a legacy of unanswered questions and unpunished evil. His death was a final, grim testament to the very ideology that had fueled his cruelty. The long-term consequence of these events is a troubling silence. In the grand sweep of World War II history, a conflict defined by the Holocaust, the firebombing of cities, and the atomic bomb, the story of these maritime atrocities has been largely forgotten. It is a footnote in the textbooks, a forgotten Holocaust of the sea. There are no grand monuments to the men of the Chisalak or the Jean Nicolet. Their story was overshadowed, their sacrifice submerged beneath the sheer scale of global suffering. This historical amnesia does a great disservice not only to the memory of the victims, but to our understanding of the war itself. It allows us to maintain a sanitized image of naval combat, a clean war of dots on a map and ships sinking gracefully into the waves when the reality was often one of medieval barbarism. The universal lesson from this dark chapter is a stark and timeless one. The laws of war, the conventions and treaties that we hold up as pillars of civilization, are terrifyingly fragile. They are not physical barriers, but agreements, promises made by nations to behave with a degree of humanity even while trying to destroy one another. And when one side decides that these promises are inconvenient, that mercy is a weakness, and that the enemy is less than human, the entire structure can collapse. The story of the Japanese submarine atrocities is a case study in how quickly a professional, disciplined military force can descend into barbarism when driven by a fanatical ideology and the pressures of a desperate war. It teaches us that civilization is not a permanent state, but a thin veneer, easily scratched away to reveal the savagery beneath. This lesson resonates powerfully in our modern world. Today, international maritime law, the direct descendant of the code so brutally violated in 1944, governs the passage of ships and the conduct of navies across the globe. We see disputes over freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and we rely on these established rules to prevent conflict. The principles of humane treatment for prisoners of war remain a cornerstone of international law, a standard by which we judge the conduct of nations in conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East. The story of the I-8 and the cruiser Tone serves as a permanent warning of what happens when these principles are abandoned. It reminds us that the dehumanization of an enemy, whether through propaganda, political rhetoric, or military indoctrination, is the first and most crucial step on the road to atrocity. Once you convince your soldiers that the people they are fighting are not people at all, you have opened the door to unimaginable cruelty. In the end, the protest delivered by the British on June 5, 1944, was more than just a diplomatic note. It was an assertion of principle in the face of nihilism. It was a declaration that even in the midst of the most destructive war in human history, there were still lines that could not be crossed, that some acts were so vile they violated not just a treaty but our common humanity. We must remember the sailors of the Daisy Mauler, the Nancy Mauler, the SS Ascot, the Jean Nicolet, the British Chivalry, the Chiselak, and the Bahar. We must remember them not just as statistics of tonnage sunk, but as men who faced two enemies, the unforgiving sea and a human foe who had abandoned all mercy. They were denied the dignity of a sailor's death, killed not by the fortunes of war, but by a cold, calculated policy of extermination. Their story is a heavy one, but it is one we are obligated to carry. It is a solemn reminder that the laws protecting sailors, soldiers, and civilians in times of war were written in the blood of those who suffered when no such laws existed, or when they were willfully ignored. The greatest tribute we can pay them is to never forget the price of that lawlessness, and to vigilantly guard the principles for which they paid the ultimate price alone in the vast silent waters of the Indian Ocean.